At the dawn of the 20th century, the nation stood restless. Factories roared, cities swelled, and immigrants poured through Ellis Island with hope in their eyes and exhaustion in their bones. Yet beneath the promise of progress, millions were shut out. Webb Du Bois saw this clearly. In 1903, in The Souls of Black Folk, he wrote of the color line, warning it would be the problem of the 20th century. Born free in Massachusetts, Harvard-trained, Du Bois believed that education and leadership could lift his people. But in the South, Jim Crow hardened, lynch mobs ruled by terror, and the ballot box was stripped away from black hands. His vision was both a warning and a demand. America could not claim democracy while millions were denied it. Meanwhile, politics shifted. The old battles of Reconstruction gave way to new divides between industry and labor, city and farm, progressives and machine bosses. Out of this turbulence emerged the fourth party system, an era shaped by reformers determined to tame corporate power, expand democracy, and wrestle with the growing pains of modern America. The progressives demanded change, trust-busting, labor protections, food safety, women's suffrage. Theodore Roosevelt gave reform its energy, William Howard Taft gave it caution, and by 1912 the country stood at a crossroads. Roosevelt's Bull Moose Rebellion split the Republican vote, and for the first time since the Civil War, a Democrat swept into power with a national mandate. Woodrow Wilson became president. Yet even as reform surged, Du Bois's warning echoed. The new freedom Wilson promised was not extended to all. The progressive era opened doors for some while slamming them shut for others, proving that the color line still marked the limits of America's democracy. The fourth party system had begun, but the struggle for freedom and equality remained unfinished. By 1912, politics seemed to shift, and with it, a fragile promise. Du Bois, weary of broken loyalties from the GOP, endorsed Woodrow Wilson, hoping this liberal Southerner might treat black men and their interests with far-sighted fairness. He urged the community toward a new political path, trusting Wilson to honor civil rights in return. Then came Wilson's presidency, a moment both hopeful and heavy. But soon the dream turned to betrayal. Within months, the administration began segregating federal offices. Black clerks were shuffled into separate lunchrooms, restrooms, and in one grave case placed behind literal cages to isolate them from white co-workers. Du Bois watched in horror as 15 of 17 black federal supervisors were fired. In March and September of 1913, Du Bois published two searing open letters in the crisis. In the first, he reminded Wilson, "We black men by our votes helped to put you in your high position, our votes helped elect you." In the second, 6 months later, he wrote, "Every enemy of the Negro race is greatly encouraged. Not a single act or word of yours has given anyone reason to infer that you have the slightest interest in the colored people." Monroe Trotter, a fellow black activist, confronted Wilson in person about segregation. The president replied that segregation was not meant to injure, but to avoid friction, and swiftly barred Trotter from ever addressing him again. Du Bois, once hopeful, joined the condemnation. Wilson was by birth unfitted for largesse of view or depth of feeling about racial injustice. Thus, what began as an experiment in cross-racial trust ended as a collapse. The election of Woodrow Wilson did usher in the fourth party system and the progressive era. But for black America, it also marked a painful reversal. The new birth of freedom that Du Bois and others had sought was stillborn in the halls of power. When Woodrow Wilson entered the White House in 1913, many black Americans still hoped the promises of progress would reach them. Instead, the opposite came. His administration segregated federal offices, humiliated black workers, and fired many from government service. Wilson, the son of a Confederate minister, spoke the language of democracy abroad while shrinking it at home. Yet, history was moving. As Wilson's policies narrowed opportunities in the South, another force began to rise, the Great Migration. Between 1915 and 1920, nearly 500,000 black men and women left cotton fields and Jim Crow towns, boarding northbound trains to Chicago, Detroit, New York, and beyond. They fled lynching, poverty, and disenfranchisement. They sought jobs in booming factories, schools for their children, and a measure of dignity denied in the South. Their movement redrew the map of America. Then came the war. In 1917, the United States entered World War I, and Wilson declared the nation would make the world safe for democracy. Over 350,000 black soldiers answered that call, serving in segregated units, many under French command. They fought in the trenches of the Western Front, bled on foreign soil, and proved their valor in the face of both enemy fire and their own nation's prejudice. But when the war ended, the contradiction was clear. Abroad, America had fought for freedom. At home, returning black veterans were met with race riots, job discrimination, and the same old Jim Crow. The Great Migration had given black Americans new strength and new voices in northern cities, but Wilson's presidency left a bitter truth exposed. The color line had not faded. The war had changed the world, but in America, the battle for democracy was still unfinished. The decades that followed brought seismic change. The 1920s under Republican rule delivered prosperity, but also speculative excess that ended in the Wall Street crash of 1929. The Great Depression followed, shaking the nation to its core. By 1932, unemployment and desperation had become daily scourges. Incumbent Herbert Hoover, seen as ineffective in the face of widespread suffering, faced Franklin D. Roosevelt, a charismatic Democrat who promised a New Deal and a path out of despair. On November 8, 1932, Roosevelt carried a crushing victory, winning 57.4% of the popular vote and 472 electoral votes, a realigning election that not only ended the fourth-party system but ushered in an era of Democratic dominance and reshaped American government for decades to come. Roosevelt's election was more than a victory, it was a national pivot. He didn't just promise recovery, he promised reinvention. With his New Deal, Roosevelt expanded federal power in ways America had never seen. Regulation of banks, job programs, protections for workers, all tools of a federal government no longer a distant observer, but an active architect of reform and recovery. Public opinion was sharply divided. Many Americans, especially among the working class and urban poor, saw Roosevelt as a savior. His fireside chats, broadcast over radio, created an unprecedented bond between president and people. Yet conservative critics and business elites accused him of overreach and socialism. Newspaper editorials from outlets like the Chicago Tribune and the Wall Street Journal decried the expansion of federal power, warning it would erode personal liberty and business freedom. Meanwhile, black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier offered a more nuanced view. They praised the economic relief New Deal programs brought to black communities, but also exposed the deep inequities in program administration, especially in the South. Segregated work sites, racist local administrators, and discriminatory hiring practices limited the full benefits of federal programs for black Americans. Still, voices like Mary McLeod Bethune emerged, pushing from inside Roosevelt's black cabinet to make federal programs more inclusive. The Wagner era, 1897-1937, was a time when the Supreme Court placed the so-called freedom of contract above nearly everything else. Striking down laws meant to protect workers, regulate hours, or set wages. In the court's eyes, economic liberty meant businesses and employees could agree to whatever terms they wanted, even if those terms meant 12-hour days in unsafe factories or starvation wages with no recourse. In practice, this meant the court repeatedly blocked efforts by states and Congress to soften the rough edges of industrial capitalism. This conservative stronghold reached its dramatic peak during Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal crisis, when 4 justices, Pierce Butler, James McReynolds, George Sutherland, and Willis Van Devanter, became known as the Four Horsemen. Together, they resisted Roosevelt's recovery programs, treating federal intervention as an existential threat to capitalism. Their counterparts, dubbed the Three Musketeers, Louis Brandeis, Benjamin Cardozo, and Harlan Stone, pushed for a constitution that could bend with the needs of a modern industrial society. Between them stood Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes and Justice Owen J. Roberts, with Hughes leaning liberal and Roberts often casting the decisive vote. For decades, the court's decisions tilted heavily toward business interests, leaving workers with few protections. But as the Great Depression deepened and public pressure mounted, the old order began to crack. In 1937, a shift in judicial philosophy opened the door to a new era, one where labor rights, collective bargaining, and the Wagner Act would redefine the balance of power between workers, employers, and the state. The year 1937 became a constitutional turning point. After years of striking down labor protections, the Supreme Court suddenly upheld the Wagner Act, which guaranteed workers the right to unionize and bargain collectively. It was a stunning reversal, nicknamed the switch in time that saved 9. For the first time in decades, the court acknowledged that protecting workers and stabilizing the economy was a legitimate use of government power. Franklin Roosevelt, frustrated by years of conservative obstruction, had tried to push through his court-packing plan, a proposal to add more justices sympathetic to the New Deal. The plan outraged even his allies in Congress and was ultimately defeated. But in a twist of irony, he didn't need it. With Justice Owen Roberts' change of heart and retirements among the old guard, the court itself evolved, marking the end of the Wagner era and ushering in a new constitutional consensus, one that accepted a larger federal role in social welfare programming. Yet as labor rights and social programs were secured, Black Americans remained on the outside. Segregated unions and racist hiring practices kept inequality at bay, even as laws advanced. By 1940, the nation's focus shifted from strikes and court battles to the looming threat of global war. The Supreme Court's battles over contracts and collective bargaining would soon be overshadowed by the urgent question of how a democracy mobilizes for survival and how the Constitution adapts when America marches into World War II. When Franklin Roosevelt came into office in 1932, Black Americans were among the hardest hit by the Great Depression. In cities like Detroit and Chicago, unemployment reached nearly 50–60%, double or triple the white rate. Relief programs like the WWII offered jobs and a lifeline. By the mid-1930s, 1 in 3 Black families was on relief, and another 250,000 were on WWII payrolls. For many, it was the first time the federal government felt like a partner in survival. But the New Deal was a mixed blessing. Programs such as the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 set national minimum wages, but often pushed Black workers out of low-skill jobs. As economist Thomas Sowell observed, laws that raised wage floors sometimes closed the door of opportunity. A job at a modest wage was still a rung on the ladder, and when that rung disappeared, so did a worker's chance to climb. Even so, Black families showed remarkable strength. By 1940, about 3 out of 4 Black children lived with both parents, a level of stability that would tragically decline in later generations, despite greater federal assistance. Education was also a beacon of progress. In 1940, fewer than 8% of Black adults had finished high school, compared to about 24% of whites, but literacy had soared from under 20% in 1870 to more than 80% by 1930. Black colleges and teachers were producing a rising professional class, and the Great Migration was carrying millions northward toward better jobs and greater hope. By the eve of World War II, the stage was set. A community battered by the Depression but proving resilient, climbing steadily upward and ready to press for more, especially as America turned its attention to war and democracy abroad. In 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt won a record-setting third term in office, a unique achievement in U.S. history, largely due to the looming global conflict of World War II. With war already raging in Europe and Asia, Roosevelt initially maintained an official policy of neutrality, though he provided material support to Britain and its allies through the Lend-Lease Act, 1941. By the early 1940s, the groundwork had been laid. Black Americans, scarred by depression but strengthened by resilience, were climbing step by step in education, work, and family stability. Yet the nation was about to face a far greater test. On a cold December evening in 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed the nation by radio. His voice was steady but urgent. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." Europe was in flames under Hitler's blitzkrieg, and Britain stood alone. America was not yet in the war, but Roosevelt made it clear. Neutrality was no longer an option. Factories that once built cars and refrigerators would now forge tanks, ships, and planes. Then on December 7, 1941, everything changed. Japanese planes roared over Pearl Harbor, sinking battleships, destroying aircraft, and killing over 2,400 Americans. The nation was stunned, its illusions of distance shattered in a single day of fire and smoke. The next morning, Roosevelt stood before Congress and delivered one of the most famous lines in American history. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked. His words galvanized the country. Within hours, Congress declared war, and America entered World War II with a resolve unlike anything seen before. Mobilization for war transformed every corner of American life. Overnight, unemployment vanished, Men left factory floors for the front lines and women stepped into jobs once closed to them. Riveters, welders, assembly line workers. Rosie the Riveter wasn't just a poster, she was a symbol of a nation rewriting its rules about who could work and what they could achieve. Black Americans too demanded their share of the promise. A. Philip Randolph threatened a massive march on Washington unless defense industries opened their doors to black workers. Roosevelt responded with Executive Order 8802, banning racial discrimination in defense jobs and planting an early seed for the civil rights movement. Labor unions swelled in membership, and while strikes were curbed during wartime, the promise of collective bargaining secured in the Wagner Act helped workers negotiate better wages and conditions in a booming war economy. Though enforcement was weak, this order marked the first federal action against employment discrimination and laid the groundwork for future civil rights policies. During the war, over 1.2 million black men served in the U.S. military, though they did so in segregated units. Notably, the Tuskegee Airmen, an all-black squadron of fighter pilots, distinguished themselves in combat, challenging racial stereotypes and advocating for the desegregation of the military. By 1945, America's arsenal had not only armed the Allies but reshaped its own society. Women had proven themselves indispensable in industry, black workers had taken a bold step toward equality, and unions had entrenched themselves as guardians of the working class. But just as victory seemed within reach, tragedy struck the heart of the nation. In April 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the steady voice who had guided Americans through the darkest days of depression and war, was silenced by sudden death. A nation wept, stunned that the man who had been its anchor for over a decade would not live to see the peace he fought so fiercely to secure. Into the Oval Office stepped Harry Truman, a plain-spoken Missourian, little known beyond his state but now carrying the weight of the free world on his shoulders. Within months, he would face a decision unlike any in history, to unleash the most destructive weapon ever created. The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended World War II, but they also cast a long shadow over the future. The guns of war grew silent, but a darker battle began: the Cold War. With it came a false gospel of social justice, promising heaven on earth by tearing down capitalism, sowing class and racial division, binding people to government dependency, and uprooting the sacred two-parent household. It was a doctrine of man, not of God. And as Scripture warns, you will know them by their fruits. Every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. And every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Matthew 7:16-19.